Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the LitRPG podcast. I'm Ramon Mejia. This is episode number 43 of the podcast. I'm here to bring you the latest LitRPG news, reviews, and of course, author interviews. Now before we begin, I want to give a quick shout out to our latest supporters for the podcast. These guys actually donated funds directly to the podcast outside of Patreon. They just dropped it on the podcast through PayPal. They donated some moolah, some bones, some lettuce and cabbage. And for those of you folks who didn't grow up in the 1920s as a gangster, money, dollars. Michael Scott Earl and Daniel Schinahofen both gave some direct donations to the podcast. Michael gave $30 and Daniel gave a whopping $100 donation. So thank you both guys for being such amazing supporters. I very rarely get direct donations like this, and certainly not those figures sometimes. So thanks a lot for your guys' support. Okay, this week we'll be talking about some new LitRPG titles and my thoughts on them, beginning with the Karmadont chess set, which is The Way the Shaman Book 5. Then also Eyrth Online, spelled with a Y. The Memoirs of Lawrence Wrath. And then Valhalla Online. Additionally, Digital Me. And then New Horizons, which is Book 4 in the Emerilia series. And then Galactic Fists of Legend Volume 2. After that, World Keeper, Birth of a World. And finally, Primal Gaming, The Murder of Timothy Smithton, Part 1, which is a LitRPG erotica story. So 8 titles to review it on the podcast. But of course, we're going to begin our show, though, with LitRPG news. And in LitRPG news, our first story is going to be about Delvers LLC Obligations Incurred. This is going to be out this week. At the time most of you are watching this, it'll already be out. And the author has stated that the audiobook version will be out by the end of April, beginning of May, and of course will be read by the amazing Jeff Hayes. However, to celebrate the book's release, their author commissioned a rap video. We'll link the show notes for you guys. We'll play a little bit as I'm talking, of course, but it is quite entertaining to read or to listen to and watch. So there you go. Fun. Okay. Additionally, Justin Miller, author of a number of LitRPG stories, including one reviewing later today, sent a message to the podcast letting us know that the audiobook version of World Seed, one of my favorite LitRPG series, is going to be ready to ship about April the 11th. So if you folks are looking for new LitRPG audiobooks, I highly encourage you to go check that one out when it comes out. Okay, now speaking of LitRPG audiobooks, we have a couple of new ones that came out the end of last week and this week. We have Eden's Gate, The Reborn, a LitRPG adventure, book 1, out now. And additionally this week, Lion's Quest Undefeated also came out as an audiobook. So there you go, guys. Okay, now some other things that came out this week, but I haven't reviewed. I'll be talking about them next week. Corpse Run, a LitRPG adventure. This is book 3 in the Crucible Shard series. Ever Realm, and also Fjorgen. Don't ask me to spell it. A Rebel Rises. And then Spectres in Skin, Exodus, and of course Delvers LLC, Obligations Incurred, which should have come out the day that most people will be seeing this. And now, in upcoming LitRPG, I'm not really sure when Earth Tactic Advance Volume 1 is going to come out officially. It was supposed to be at the end of March. I'm hoping it comes out any day now. On the 11th of April, we'll get Dominion's Blade, a LitRPG adventure. On the 12th of April, we'll get the 5th book in the Critical Failure series, Critical Failure book 5. V is for 5. On the 25th of April, This Is Our Land, Emerilia book 5. And on the 28th of April, we'll see Lost Archive, a LitRPG adventure, Veilwalker's book 1. These titles are long sometimes. And then on May 1st, Ascend Online finally comes into our shelves. Hell to Pay, book 2 in that series. On May the 9th, it'll be The First Player, Alter Game Book 1. We'll get book 2 in the second of the game series called Stuck in Game on May 27th. And on the 31st, it'll be The Eternal Dragonborn, a LitRPG Saga World of Game, book 2. So that's within a couple months too. Now on to new releases and reviews. And in new releases and reviews, we're going to begin with our first story, the Karmadont chess set, Way the Shaman, book 5, written by, of course, Vasily Mahenko. This book is a whopping 504 pages. It is $5.99. It is not available on Kindle Unlimited, unfortunately. Now, full disclosure, I got an advance copy of the story to review, so it was ready when they published. But I did purchase the novel once it became available. I paid the full ticket price, folks. Okay, now, this book is set literally moments after the end of Book 4 ends, when Mahan finally takes control of the Phantom Castle, but he loses all of his class abilities for letting the big bad guy steal the Heart of Chaos, which will let him become an evil god. Spoilers. Mahan now has not only to manage his new castle, his guild, and figure out a way to restore his class, but he also has the task of making the Karmadont chess set. So there you go. That's my little synopsis. Basically, this is just a fun story. I really enjoyed it. And a lot of the recent books in the series, there's been some always huge world-changing event that puts pressure on Mahan, and of course, us as the readers, as this big expectation of things. And it's kind of gotten away from the thing I really love the most about the series, which is just a simple story of a dude adventuring, crafting some stuff. And in this book, it kind of gets back to that a little bit more. All that pressure is gone from our main character. I mean, there's still a big, huge global threat of Eyrth becoming an evil god and destroying the world, but that's really not our main character's problem in this particular book. He's literally been stripped of his character class. He can't access the quest line to deal with that problem, so he's literally been forced on a 2-month break before he can even try to get his class abilities back. So instead, he's clearing out his quest log, finishing up any loose quests he has. For example, remember all those little small quests he had from the very first and second book? Like that one with the wolves or the goblins? It's all resolved spectacularly in this particular novel. And most of the novel is like that. Older storylines are finally tied up. I mean, there's still some cool stuff that he does, some crafting, he goes on some adventures. There's a few other plot lines that were opened up in the last book that are cleared up here as well. But there's no really big political stuff happening like there was in book 4. It's Mahan, a couple of his close friends, and his new apprentice going on some quests. It's simple. Each quest is resolved before the next one comes up. There's no hopping around, starting some quests but not finishing them. None of that occurs. There's some city and village management stuff. And even later on the story, some adventures on the high seas. It's really great. It's fun. It was just, like I said, a fun, simple read. I finished the entire book in one sitting, so that's always a plus. That tells you that I enjoyed it. Be aware, though, if you're going to go into this, there is a big old WTF cliffhanger at the end of this particular story, which people have been annoyed or surprised or complained with in some of the reviews and online. And according to Vasily Mahenko, I interviewed him last year. I think it was for book 3. He'd originally planned this to be a 5-book series. So you got to keep that in mind when you're reading this, that the author had originally intended for this to end at this point. And so that is sort of reflected in some of the things he's been doing in book 4 and 5, cleaning up quest lines. And then he remembered that he had 2 more books to write for his publisher. And so that changed the story a little bit. And he actually apologized in our interview to the American authors. He's like, I have to apologize to you guys who are Americans. When you read book 5, you're going to be mad. I'm sorry. So that was really nice of him. If you watch the interview I did with him, that happens in about 20 minutes and 55 seconds. I've queued it up. There's a link in the show notes if you want to go check that out. But overall, I had a good time reading it. It gets a big 8 out of 10 for me. Okay, on to our next story, Eyrth Online. It's spelled EYRTH, which for some reason bugs me. The rest of the title is The Memoirs of Lawrence Wrath, First Playlist. This is written by someone that's not on the title list. Sorry, I forgot to write it down. Anyways, it's a really fun story. It is 97 pages. It is $1, exactly $1, not 99 cents, $1. It is available on Kindle Unlimited if you don't feel like paying that buck. It is a really interesting experiment. The author actually created a Spotify playlist that you're supposed to play as you read the novel. Like at the beginning of each chapter, it'll tell you which track to play as you read the story and listen to. And each one of those tracks is thematically appropriate for that section. Now again, for me, this was kind of a cool experiment. I normally read in a quiet, well-lit room. I might have a cup of tea if it's cold. Alternatively, if I'm working, I have a text-to-speech program that reads to me as I work. So this was a very different way for me to experience a story. How each song, again, is thematically appropriate for each chapter. And most of these songs I've never heard before. I'm not a big, giant music guy. But it was an interesting experiment. And I like that portion of it quite a bit. Now, if you're the kind of reader who can do both read and listen, you might like this better than it didn't really work out for me as much as I like the idea of it. I found it to be a little distracting. It's hard for me to do multiple things at the same time, which includes apparently listening to music while I read. But it was cool to experiment, to try something new for me. It's told in a first-person perspective from the main character. The main character actually breaks the fourth wall multiple times, talking to the reader directly, which is fine. It's just be aware of it. If that kind of thing bugs you, it's going to bug you here. Again, there are a few grammar, punctuation problems, structural issues within the story in which one thought will very often interrupt another thought mid-sentence without punctuation. So there are a few of those issues as well, but it's not, wasn't a big deal for me, but for a lot of people, it might be. Now, okay, biggest thing about the story that I had an issue with is that it takes such a long time to get into the game world, like the real game world. A lot of this is a setup for the story. About 80% of it, I'll say, of the novel passes before you actually get into the real game world. The first 10% is literally the main character telling you how awesome Eyrth Online is. The next about 45%, up to like 52%, I should say, is the main character in the virtual reality pod going through a series of tests that are the system set up for him. He goes through a bunch of weird pop culture TV show related tests that are supposed to test his various skills and attributes and give him bonuses if he does well. For example, there's a section where he's doing the Ninja Warrior training course, and he gets a record time while the song Weapon of Choice plays, and he gets the title I'm a Legend in Japan, which confers a +10 to dexterity and wisdom, and he gets the parkour skill. So that should give you an idea of the type of scenarios these are, and takes up a good portion of the story. Now, after that, character creation, there's a long list of 13 races, which went on way too long considering the main character only chooses one of them. And I feel like the rest could have been described within the story in the game world. Also, after that, he chooses difficulty settings with, related bonuses. And again, it sounds like 80% into this novel that you actually get into the game story. And even then, it's the main character's first few minutes within the story, and then it ends. And so mostly because of that reason, this isn't real LitRPG. I mean, it's the setup potentially for a good LitRPG story. I definitely like the writer's sense of humor, his willingness to explore different story concepts and just to be weird and cool and fun and interesting. I like all that experimental stuff. Unfortunately, you're missing the big part of the LitRPG story, which is the LitRPG part, the game world. I mean, just because you add +10 attributes doesn't quite make it LitRPG, and mostly because it's not that those things are there or not, it's because they don't mean anything yet, because he's not in the game world. We don't see where those things are going to apply. Hopefully, in the next book in this series, we'll see that. And the author at the beginning of the novel says, don't worry, he's going to put in more stats, levels, crafting in the next story in the serial, so I look forward to reading it. But for now, unfortunately, this story, because it's not really LitRPG, gets a 4 out of 10 for me. That's how it goes. Okay, on to our next story, Valhalla Online, a LitRPG saga written by Kevin McLaughlin. Okay, this is 285 pages, $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. The main character, Samantha, is in the military as a military police, but one day she finds herself trapped in an expensive, full immersion virtual reality MMO. It's the kind of game that people who are dying pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to have their brains uploaded to. Only she wasn't dying, and she can't remember how she got there. Okay, now Samantha as a character is really appealing. She's interesting. She rides a fine line between strong, badass, and emotionally appealing. She actively searches for a solution to finding out what happens to her and kicks some major butt. Yet there are also moments in the story when she reveals her worries and concerns of being trapped against her will in this game world, which is really makes her very empathetic to me as a reader. The combat in the story takes the realistic approach. Shields break during combat. Armor doesn't protect every area, but plate mail also protects really well against arrows, much better than leather armor. Group tactics matter. Common doesn't have a bunch of damage numbers pop up from each strike. However, the player can bring up a damage log if they want to. So the author really does emphasize realistic combat. That's not really gamified unless the player character wants it to be. And that's just a writing style choice. But a lot of the game mechanics in this story are like that. They exist, but they only exist when the main character or the players focus on those aspects of it. For example, the main character would never see a character sheet unless she actively thought, oh, what's my character sheet? And then a bunch of information will come. But otherwise, a lot of that stuff is hidden in the background. There aren't damage notifications. There aren't automatic pop notifications for XP. Or anything like that. It all exists, and the character does look at them sometimes to figure out some things like how much is she really hurting for? What does it mean to add a stat into strength as opposed to intelligence? Those things. So this is LitRPG. I'm not saying it's not, but those mechanics are definitely not the main function of the story. It's more of this character's journey in more of a fantasy setting, but because they all exist, it's definitely an RPG, and I enjoyed it myself. Actually, at the beginning of the story, like I said, most of the game mechanics are like that, and they're not. Other than those things, there's nothing that makes it stand out as being super amazing game mechanic wise. They're all pretty standard. You have skills that are learned by either using them or being taught by somebody who knows them. There are your standard stats: health, stamina, mana bars. The only sort of unique game mechanic that I haven't really seen in a lot of other places are the almost player versus player capture the castle kind of aspects of the story. And it almost feels like that portion of it was written separately from the later portion in the story, which I'll get to in a minute. The beginning portion really does feel like it's a capture the castle kind of game system. And I'm glad it didn't stick like that, because that is not really interesting to me, because it gets kind of boring if the only goal of the game is to capture someone else's castle and get points to either upgrade your character or to travel the next map, which we haven't seen yet. So I'm really glad that is not the only portion of the story. Now, that's the first portion of the story. Now, the second portion of the story has the main character forced to conquer a dungeon by herself, or face an infinite number of respawns until she does. And that second part is really what captured my imagination and won me over as liking the story. There's a lot more action in that second half, dungeon exploration. Additionally, the character explores the emotional toll it takes on her of being killed repeatedly when it feels real every single time. And her gradual acceptance of that this game world is now the place that she lives, at least for the foreseeable future, until she can figure out how to either get out or contact somebody by going through all the levels of Valhalla. Okay. For me, the game gets a 7 out of 10. I enjoyed it. Okay, on to our next story, Digital Me, written by Alston Sleet. It is 210 pages. It is $2.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Now, the story is set up in a future where humanity has created truly self-aware artificial intelligence. These digital entities quickly evolve past the physical limitations imposed by their human creators, so much so that a brief war with the artificial intelligence was averted within moments by key assassinations of the world leaders involved in the plot. Basically, the robots kick everyone's butts, and they become their own digital nation and entity, even going so far as having their own laws that only apply to them. They advance beyond humans in so many ways. Quantum physics, they travel through space. We're like pets to them, basically, in this distant future story. And that's basically the first 10% of the story. Now, where our main character comes in, Sean Bradshaw, he has cancer, and he kind of plots this really weird and twisted way to become a digital citizen himself, because it's not socially acceptable or legally possible. So he finds a legal loophole in which he can basically become a digital person, and they accept him. They take his brain and they upload it to this virtual reality system where it's basically a training ground from him to transcend from human mindsets, human constraints of an organic system into a true digital mind. And that's what this story is. It's set in a world that for him is essentially supposed to be a training ground where he's supposed to spend the next 700,000 years but in real time, it's like a second. But in the digital world, it's 700,000 years where you're supposed to learn a bunch of things. And that premise is kind of cool. I really did like the sci-fi aspects of it. It's just that none of it matters, in the ultimate story. It's all a real big 10% setup of you're in a fantasy world. You're immortal because you can respawn infinitely. Anywhere you save, basically. Anytime he saves, if he dies, he just goes back to that last save point. And sort of the unintended consequences of having this fantasy world set up, which is not just designed for him, but for anybody who's trying to transition into a digital entity, of putting essentially an immortal wizard there. And the unintended social consequences, economic consequences, and political consequences, very much so, of an immortal wizard being placed in that fantasy world. And even though it is set in a virtual reality game world of sorts, none of that matters. I mean, it sort of does because it's a game world and there's a sort of level of description and of progress. So yeah, okay. And again, okay, so technically it is LitRPG. The author has a game world setting, and it's obviously described. The main character grows in power according to those game rules in an obvious way. So he meets the two qualifiers I have for LitRPG. It is. But it really feels like a technicality. Most of the vibe of the story is a fantasy, political, and intrigue. And very quickly, once the main character gets into the game world, after like an initial learning section where he gets to learn some of the rules, he's taught by a fairy guide, he kills some monsters, and he finds a beginner town where he kind of levels up a little bit. After that point, once he gets into like the big city, it stops really being a LitRPG story. It really does focus on the politics, intrigue of him as an immortal wizard being more powerful than the king, and the political consequences within that king's circle. And it kind of goes in that direction. And that's fine. It's not my kind of story. I should say that's not the story that I'm usually interested. I'm not really interested in stories about political intrigue. It's not my kind of thing. For me, there's not nearly enough action in the story. I mean, there are some action scenes and they're fine, but they're a very small portion of it, as are the game mechanics. For about, I'd say 3/4 of the novel, it's really more about politics, intrigue, social structures, and it's all very logical within the sense of if this occurred, these other things would happen. But it just really wasn't my cup of tea. And maybe as you as a reader, if you're more into politics and political intrigue kind of stories, you'll enjoy it a lot more than I did. But for me, it's just, it wasn't my kind of thing. So that's kind of it. I mean, I guess, my score, 6 out of 10. Okay, on to our next story. New Horizons, Emerilia, Book 4. Written by Michael Chatfield. Michael Chatfield, a very consistently good storyteller, writer. This story, in a very single phrase, is an upkeep story, which we'll get a description of. It is 312 pages. It is $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Now, as for the story premise, summary, Dave, our main character, is back with the Stone Raiders Guild, and they're still trying to clear and prepare the cities for the Eyrth race to come back to. The final section of the Eyrth College is they have to fight a wicked and dug-in enemy, the Archlich. Boom, boom, boom. It's a huge, amazing battle. I encourage you to read it just for that scene alone, for that combat scene. Really good. Good action. There's minimal crafting in the story. And they talk about alliances with the Eyrth, Beastmen, demons, but all that's been talked about before. Like I said, this really does feel like an upkeep and maintenance book. And what I mean by that is if you've ever played an MMO or an RPG, oftentimes right before you go into a new area of the game, you lose access to all your old quests. You want to clean up those quests. You want to finish all the small quests that you haven't finished, or you kind of forgot about, or the old storylines. And that's what's happening here in this particular book. It's also happened a lot in any LitRPG series where it's like of a really large scope, once they start introducing guilds and large scale battles, and you start hopping around the globe in places, this tends to happen eventually. where at some point the author writes a novel and it's mostly about just cleaning up old storylines, finishing off old plots, and just kind of cleansing the palate of the reader so they can really appreciate all this cool new stuff coming in the pipeline. And that's what this is for a lot of things. A lot of this happens. You get updates on a bunch of stuff that happened in book 1. Remember that starter town that Dave created in the very first book? Hey, you get to learn more about it. And that place gets an upgrade and a bunch of political alliances and, a bunch of stuff like that. And it is what it is. That doesn't make the story any less enjoyable, but just be aware that this is not the best book in the series. I'm hoping that the next book is going to be the best book in the series because this has a lot of, like I said, upkeep and maintenance. And that's fine. It happens in any kind of long series. It's bound to happen. There are, of course, new things that do happen, new political alliances, new economic stuff, trade, a few new quest lines open up. But for the most part, it's mostly upkeep and maintenance, which is fine. And again, outside of that, in the very first half of the book, there was a really cool, huge battle scene with the Lich. And that's kind of the big action scene of the novel. There are, of course, hints at things that are going to be coming up in the series, which includes a huge war with the demons at Demon's Crater and potentially some economic warfare with the Trade Guild. So there you go. For me, it gets a score of 7 out of 10. Okay, on to our next story, Galactic, Fist of Legend, Volume 2. Written by Scotty Hooch. Okay, this is the second book in this series. I really like the first book. If you're not aware of what happened in the first book, without spoiling it too much, essentially the Earth is being taken over by aliens for entertainment, and a bunch of people are transported to these game worlds, in which case as long as they're entertaining people and they're all alive in these game worlds, Earth is not going to be taken over by these bad alien people. And our main character is Scotty, which most of the characters in the author series are named. He is dropped into this undead zombie world in book 1. He kicks butt, takes names, goes through a lot of smaller mini game adventures. It's really cool. This is basically fan service to a bunch of video game and pop culture reference type stuff, and it's really enjoyable. It's just a fun series. Now, the main character, Scotty, begins this book flush with experience points and credits, looking to upgrade his gear. He runs into Samantha. He finally makes her a companion, and just as she's being introduced to the multiverse that he exists in, Scotty gets a new world to unlock. He's whisked away to a dark fantasy world filled with the souls of the undead. And if he can conquer the quest for this place, he'll unlock a new land to farm experience points for, which is what he uses to get upgrades, increase his stats, and all that kind of stuff. And again, this is just a fun fan service novel. There's a lot of satire of video game tropes and video game characters and video game settings and pop culture settings, TV, bunch of stuff. It's really, like I said, it's just a fun LitRPG story, which I really enjoy. I always have a good time reading Scott Fuchs's novels. This gets an easy score, 7 out of 10. I enjoyed it. Okay. It's always the easy ones that are so easy to review, I know. World Keeper is next. Birth of a World, written by Justin Miller. We just talked about him. Okay, this one is a whopping 589 pages for the low price of $3.99, folks. Get it now. And it's not available on Kindle Unlimited. And again, this is mostly because the author also has his stories online, and in other locations. So this is a great way to support him. If you read it online, he comes from the Royal Road gang and of course, his free online stories. So if you read it online, go support him, pick it up. But basically this is a new type of LitRPG story. And it's not going to be for everybody. I'll tell you up front. If you're a fan of Civilization, of Topia, Banished, those kind of games where you're a world and empire builder, and you do a lot of city management and resource kind of games, you're going to like the story. That's basically what this is. And a lot of the narration is told from that perspective. But if you don't like this kind of games, you're not going to like this kind of story. I love those kind of games, I should say. I've spent, 20, 30, 40, 50 hours on games like Civilization. It's my kind of thing. I always love a good LitRPG story. It takes new game systems and creates stories around them. And this is one of those times where that's the case for me. I really enjoyed it because one part it's new and it's like, oh, I've played those games and I've often thought about, okay, what would it be like to create my own universe, my own world in which I had absolute control over everything. Races. Do I want to be fantasy, sci-fi? Do I want to give them special bonuses? How do I want to influence their cultures? And all that exists within this story. So if you're that kind of person who's had those kind of weird fantasies, you're going to enjoy the story. And Justin Miller always does a really good job of applying his love of video games and creating some really good stories around that and making them really logical. Like nothing happens that doesn't make sense within the context of the story. So there you go. The main character of the World Keeper, Dale, accidentally kills the creator of our world and takes up the mantle of World Keeper. He designs and creates a new fantasy world that has elves, beastmen, humans, and of course, magic. Now eventually he'll compete with other World Keepers that have created their own worlds in realms and realm battles, but for now he's focused on his world's development. Now occasionally, Dell actually descends into the world to build up his own strength and unlock features that the regular sentients haven't yet. Now this is kind of a departure from that kind of storyline where it's just him talking about and describing the things that are happening as he's like the god of the world almost. He eventually sometimes just, it becomes a small adventure story of him going down, killing things, becoming more powerful. But it's a two-edged sword in this particular mechanic, because if he goes down to the world he created, he can actually be killed and someone else will become the new World Keeper. So it's kind of an interesting way of creating risk for the character, which I liked. And again, this is a specialty novel, which you talked about already, so you're either going to really like it or you're not going to be interested at all. I'd say pick up a sample of it on Amazon if you're not really sure, or look it up online. You can check it. I mean, he has the stuff out on Rareware for free, so it's there. But for me, it was interesting and fun, mostly because I like those kind of stories. So for me, it is a clear 7 out of 10. Okay, on to Primal Gaming. The Murder of Timothy Smithton, Part 1, written by Catherine T. Knight. It is 127 pages, 99 cents. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. Now, this is a really simple review as well. This is well priced, but it is not LitRPG. It says in the title, what they talk about is being a LitRPG story. Part of the description is this: a satirical LitRPG erotic crime thriller novella. A lot of genres for one story. And honestly, most of those don't exist within the story of the context. It is an erotica. It's sort of a crime thriller. It is not a LitRPG, and it's not particularly satirical. This is not a bad erotic story. I'm not going to describe the sex in this, so don't worry about it, guys. But within the context of this story, it's more of an erotic, maybe crime thriller, set in a virtual reality world. And that virtual reality world allows for some interesting exploration of sex fantasies. And that it's a really unique way of using virtual reality, honestly, that I had never considered. And I think the medium really does work for it, because you can do a bunch of things that you couldn't do in a regular normal world setting. Like you could be an elf, you could be any, character, you can do gender bender stuff, you could switch, genders or whatever you're going to do. And within the virtual reality setting, it makes sense. So I like the fact that the author chose to use this medium, but that doesn't necessarily make it a LitRPG story just because it's set in a virtual reality game. That's not what a LitRPG is. Okay, because this is mostly because the extent of the game mechanic stuff is just that it exists in a virtual reality world. There are no game mechanics, no levels, no stats, no XP. Honestly, none of that stuff. It just takes place in a game, and that's not enough to make a LitRPG. If you want to read some really good LitRPG erotica, I'd suggest you read some of Scotty Fucci stuff. The Galatea series and the Freelance Saga series, those are both more along those lines. And if you just want some casual, most of Scotty's stuff actually has like sexuality in it. It's just not erotic necessarily in most of his other stories, like the one we just talked about, and also Origin to ARS. Some of the sex is there, but it's fade to black or just doesn't exist. But sexuality and attraction between men and women or wherever, that all exists in his stories, no matter what he writes. But he does specifically have some LitRPG erotica. If you want to go look it up online, his stuff is definitely more LitRPG. Okay, that's it. We're done. Finito. I know, 8 stories. Okay. There's a bunch of places you can follow and watch us, and Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Patreon. We'll have a link in the show notes. If you want to support the podcast in any way, shape, or form, you can find out all the ways to do so at litrpgpodcast.com/support. But that's it. Thanks for hanging out with me, everybody. Until we can hang out again, folks, remember to go read some LitRPG. Bye.